All right. So I am here to talk about my company CHOMP, which I'll get to a little bit later. I want to set up kind of why we are building what we're building. And it's centered around the idea that incentives do not actually rule the world, despite the meme that we're all familiar with. Perceptions actually do, because incentives modify perception, and that's how they work. So we're all very familiar with this meme. You know, Charlie Munger, one of the great investors of all time, is very famous for saying, "Show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcome." Because if you can predict what people will do based on how they're incentivized, you can determine what will actually happen in the future. So utility in economics, which is basically like the value or happiness or senses that somebody gets, is defined as the perceived multidimensional value received by an agent taking an action. And they use this really fun word called utils, which means absolutely nothing to normal people. But what that actually encapsulates is that people receive value across many dimensions, not just finance. There can be social incentives. There can be reasons that I'm taking an action that are only known to me. And it can appear irrational to other people, be very rational for myself. And this is very important because it is about people's perceptions of an incentive, and that's what will define whether or not they take an action, not the incentive itself. And so if things are priced at expected utility, which is, we just talked about utility, to an individual, and expected utility is the total value perceived by that agent, then incentives function by modifying that perception, not the behavior. The behavior is the downstream outcome of modifying the perception of the value received from taking an action. And so we have this cool chart here that I made. If you took like Bio 101, you might recognize this. This is stolen from neuroscience, which is my first love. So this is an action potential. And we're building consumer apps. And so we want to create a group of users who are persistently activated, who come on every day, who do something, and they interact with the application, and they're contributing to the ecosystem. And that's really what you're after. Second, after that, you want to avoid suppressed behavior. So the difference here is if somebody comes onto your app, protocol, whatever, and they have, a negative experience, they're probably not going to be able to come back as easily as you got them on the first time. And so they'll have a higher activation or a higher amount of activation that they need to get over this threshold. And this threshold is where somebody has to be to take an action. If you're not above this threshold, you will not take an action. And if you are above this threshold, you are going to take an action because you perceive the value of that action to be something greater than the cost that it would take you for that action. And again, this is not necessarily financial. Like there's energy costs of taking an action. There's mental costs. I think working in startups, a great example of this is switch costs. The switch cost of, thinking about one thing and then a wholly different thing and then switching back can be pretty high. And so we want to optimize first for people who are persistently activated and minimize people who have suppressed behavior. And the way to do this is actually, as we discussed, like multidimensional. So it's not just about a financial incentive, but also a social incentive, the emotions that people feel when they use your application, how you can get them to connect with the idea or the content or the vision of the product. And these are all things that make a difference in how activated one of your users might be. And so in reality, perceptions are what rule the world, not incentives. And there are many, many more ways of modifying perceptions than financial incentives. I feel like this slide is pretty self-explanatory at this point. Like we all have social media. We all know we're being manipulated. We all know that the AI recommendation feeds are showing us what we will react to the most, not necessarily what we care about the most, what we want to see the most. And so everything that we see, the conversations that we have, the propaganda from whatever country we reside in, All of these things are attempting to modify our perceptions in different ways. So who has seen this image before? Right. So is this black and blue or white and gold? Does anyone want to say? All right, so this is actually a black and blue dress. But I don't know, like 9, 10 years ago, if you're old like me, you will remember this image going viral online. And there was this massive debate about what color this dress was. And it's the only difference is how people perceive it, like how your brain works, what you see. In reality, the dress is black and gold, but people see this image and they see different colors. And that gets at kind of how perceptions can be these really evolving things and very different between different people or different groups of people. And there are actually realms of science and psychology and economics that explicitly study the ways that our own brains trick us. So you might not know what nudge is or thinking fast and slow is, but both of these books are Nobel Prize winning economics theories, nudge theory and prospect theory, that talk about how our environment can manipulate our decisions or how our own brain can manipulate our decisions. So a great example from prospect theory is something called loss aversion. So psychologically, we feel losses more than we feel a win. So if we win $1, we'll feel, 10 utils of goodness. If we lose $1, we'll feel 15 utils of badness. And that is actually very important because it's the same incentive, but your perception is actually changed. You lose $1, make $1. That doesn't change. But the amount of utility that you get from that and how you feel does change. And so these things are also trying to manipulate our perceptions in every way. People don't necessarily think that, Claude or ChatGPT are trying to manipulate them. But these things actually learn to be incredibly sycophantic, which basically means they're going to tell you what you want to hear because that's how they get the best feedback and they optimize their rewards functions. And then this is just one of the most famous images from where I'm from, the US, in our propaganda. This was a World War I image to recruit people to the army. And it is one of the most famous propaganda campaigns in the US. It was incredibly successful at getting people to sign up for the army in a time where they didn't really want to. And they only did that because they changed how people perceived the action of going into the army. They made it worth it to go into the army because if you weren't fighting for the country, they made you feel like you were not really part of the population and not part of the community, and you weren't fighting for it. And so these are all different ways, other than strictly financial incentives, to modify our perceptions and modify our downstream behaviors as a result of that. So how do we deal with this problem? Like, how do we solve this? We fight back by creating better perceptions of reality. That seems really obvious. That's the problem. Make them better. Cool. How do you do that? Well, you can actually use incentives to do that. We can create markets for information that produce very high signal, manipulation resistant information. And the information that these markets produce can actually create less manipulable population level beliefs and provide access to previously hidden or latent information that can be acted upon. A great example of this is actually the guy who made $100 million on Polymarket asked people how they thought their neighbors would vote in the 6 swing states that really mattered for the US election in November. And they all said their neighbors would vote for Trump. But if you had asked them who they would vote for, they probably would have said Biden, despite the fact that they may have voted for Trump. Because simply the social perception of being a Trump supporter at that time was a negative payoff. And so prediction markets actually are one form of doing this, but they're limited. Prediction markets can give us probabilities about, who will get elected, about, whether or not someone will invade someone else, whether or not, someone's going to do something crazy on stage at a conference. And prediction markets are really good at estimating the probabilities of objectively resolvable real world events. but there is a massive amount of information that we do not have proper public markets for. And this kind of information is much harder to deal with because it doesn't objectively resolve. And so you need to create a way for markets to resolve. And this is about subjective information, social predictions, opinions, beliefs, thoughts. How people think is actually incredibly valuable information. And there is not enough of it online or anywhere, really, that is getting at what people won't say. Because there's a massive amount that you wouldn't say to the public, to people that you don't know, whatever, and you cover your true beliefs. And that is actually bad. That creates worse outcomes for communities, for society at scale. So that is actually what we are working on at CHOMP. So CHOMP, motherfuckers. So what does CHOMP do? CHOMP asks a bunch of questions. They can be about objectively resolvable things like elections, like markets, like was this made by AI, or they can be about how people think. Do I look good in my outfit right now? Is Margot Robbie mid is a very recent debate on Twitter, which is just a crazy take to me because no. But these are all questions that you could not resolve a market for because they do not have an objective real-world resolution, but that could be valuable for somebody out there or for you. Or maybe you're just curious to see what people think. And so this actually unlocks a novel feature for the internet at scale. Never before on the internet have you been able to ask a question to a highly targeted group of people and have that answer be both honest, revealing private information, and manipulation resistant. So people are not trying to game the system to make you believe something else because that would be unprofitable for them to do. And so this is an incredibly important feature. There are a lot of ways that you can use this from, commissioning a survey like the Polymarket Trader that I mentioned earlier did in November to having a conversation with your friends. And yeah, this is a completely new feature for the internet. Never before have you been able to point to something in information space and say, hey, create me high signal manipulation resistant information about this. And with CHOMP, you will be able to do that. So if you want to work on these kinds of problems, if this sounds interesting to you, please reach out. We would love to build with you. And we'd love for you to CHOMP and give us feedback. So please scan the QR code, try it out. I have 2 more minutes, so I'll talk a little bit about how CHOMP actually works. So CHOMP is a quiz game on the front end, as you saw with kind of like the questions. But people actually answer 2 questions for each individual question. The first is, what do you think the answer is? And the second is, what % of people do you think will agree with you? And it's the second question that really gets at these latent, private, hidden beliefs that can be very valuable to be acted upon. And that's basically how it works. If you get questions right, you earn bonk. If you don't, you lose. Sorry. There's also free questions if you don't want to pay or participate in the markets and just try it out and have some fun. Can earn some points, potentially earn bonk from a raffle. And yeah, please reach out with any questions, comments, feedback. Would love to hear everything you think about the app and the game. And if this sounds interesting and you want to work on this, please come find me.